The Alabama Booksmith presents Author Spotlight. Because every book in our store is signed, our Wall of Fame displays a breathtaking array of writers and signatures. Close-up shots reveal giants of literature, acclaimed historians, stars of stage and screen, our nation's leaders, famous sports heroes, and thousands of other esteemed authors. Today's Wall of Fame guest is Monty Burke, who will discuss Lords of the Fly, Madness, Obsession, and the Hunt for the World Record Tarpon. And here's our host, Jake Reese.
Welcome. We are delighted to chat with Monty Burke from his home in Brooklyn. Hi, Monty. How you doing, bud?
Hey, Jake. It's good to see you. Wish I could see you in person.
We can't wait. Next time. We miss you. By way of introduction, Monty Burke is one of America's most respected sports writers. His books include In Search of Silver, Leaper, Sow Belly, Fourth and Gold, and Saban, The Making of a Coach. He has been a lead writer at Forbes for many years, where he now serves as editor. Sports Illustrated named Sow Belly one of their best books of the year. His new release, Lords of the Fly, will become an instant classic for every man, woman, and child who gets a charge out of attempting to lure any kind of fish from any kind of water. Monty, I'm sorry to say, no interest in fishing, but was enthralled with your book. Great job. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I hope that you're not the only non-fisherman who likes it. I mean, I sort of wrote, I didn't write it with fishermen in mind, actually. I kind of wrote it with people who enjoy weird tales about obsessive little subcultures in mind. I guess that was the sort of what I had in mind when I was writing it.
Well, you were very successful. It hooked, if you'll excuse the pun, it hooked me. I'd like to start our book chat with a fascinating discovery. I have firsthand knowledge of the million-dollar motorhomes football fans drive on Saturdays to cheer for the Tide and Tigers, the enormous contributions they make to their alma maters for luxury boxes and parking privileges and the like. But after reading your book, though they seem like peanuts compared to the investments of time, energy, and fortunes these characters in Lords of the Fly shovel into their sport.
Mm-hmm.
Give us an idea of what these folks are willing to pay.
So let's take Tom Evans as a good example of, he may be an extreme example, but I think he's a pretty good example for this. He's the character within this book who we start with way back in 1977 and who we end with in 2019. And he has been after the world record tarpon for those years, from 77 all the way up to 2019. And he's been after it in particular for 41 of those, or 42 of those 44 years, he's been going to Homosassa, which is a little town about 70 miles north of Tampa. And he's kept these great log books, which I got to see as I was reporting all of this stuff. And I calculated how much time he had spent there. It turned out that he'd spent about 3.5 years of his life on a boat on the flats of Homosassa, bobbing around, looking for a big tarpon with a fly rod. And so he described it really well, I thought. He said there were three sort of tolls taken on a person after a world record fish like a tarpon, which is such a dynamic and huge and incredible fish. There's the financial toll. So he spent, gobs of money on guides and staying at places and flying all around the place. There's the, sort of the emotional toll, the mental toll. and stare sometimes, oftentimes actually in Homosassa, which doesn't have that many fish, staring at just a completely empty sea. And then, he talks about there's also, of course, the physical toll, which you can actually see in Tom Evans. He's now 82 years old, but he can stand for about a minute, I'd say now. His back is all messed up. He has all sorts of different things, but mainly it's his back. And a lot of that has come through, these 44 years of doing this pretty strenuous sport. I mean, what's cool about tarpon fishing, what really got me into it is that, it's one of the few sports where the few outdoor sports where the prey fights back, and the prey, so to speak, you're not killing most of these tarpon, usually wins. They usually either exhaust the angler and the angler just says, forget it, and pops them off, or they break a rod, a reel, a line, whatever, before the angler can make that decision. So, there's those three, just to answer your questions, it was those three sort of tolls, I guess, that it takes on people who are this dedicated to this sport.
You called Tom Evans the Babe Ruth of fly fishing.
Mm-hmm.
What a guy he is. You also profile the Joe DiMaggio and the Muhammad Ali of tarpon fly fishing.
Yep. Yep.
In fact, one of the greatest athletes who ever lived in another sport made quite an impression on fishing, and that's, of course, Ted Williams. Would you give us an insight into the impact the splendid splinter had in fishing?
So Ted, as we all know, was, arguably, to some people think he's the greatest baseball player of all time. He's certainly in the discussion. Hand-eye coordination off the charts. I think you could make an argument at one point in his life, or at various points in his life, he was the best baseball player in the world. Then he was the best fighter pilot in the world. And then he was the best fly angler in the world. So he had this incredible hand-eye coordination, of course, this incredible eyesight. His cast was as smooth and beautiful as any cast ever been made by a fly rod. He loved three fish in particular. He loved bonefish, Atlantic salmon. He loved tarpon, but his overall favorite was tarpon. He just loved the Silver King, is what he called him. And he shows up in the book actually a couple times. He shows up as sort of a mentor to the guy, the Muhammad Ali of the tarpon world, which was a guy named Stu Apt, who's now 90 years old, who is one of those guys. I guess Dizzy Dean's phrase would best describe him. It ain't bragging if you could back it up. Stu likes to talk about himself, but he's such a good angler that he's never lying. So Ted Williams kind of became a mentor to Stu Apt, and then Ted Williams, when the big fish, these huge, enormous tarpon were discovered off Homosassa, Ted, of course, went there, and he got pretty obsessed himself. He got so obsessed that he would, with his guide, they would sit at night at dinner, and he would demand that everyone who was fishing with him only eat what the tarpon eat, so that they could only have crabs, mullet, and shrimp for dinner. That was it. They couldn't eat anything else that a tarpon wouldn't eat. And Ted runs into a bunch of different people who are also characters in the book. But at some point, Ted becomes once Homosassa becomes discovered, once the hordes of people come down, all the other record chasers, Jack Nicklaus shows up, Bobby Orr shows up, ABC films a special, 3M, the big conglomerate, makes a movie. I mean, it becomes this sort of madhouse. And Ted at that point just says, I'm out. He's, was an introvert. He didn't really like people all that much. He loved children. He didn't really like adults. So he just kind of gave up and went back home to Key West. Interesting little, side note to this. He actually ended up back in the area a couple of years before he died. He became the spokesman for a sort of retirement community in Crystal River. And he lived there his last few years before he has his kind of bizarre posthumous life when his head was separated from his body and mistreated in a facility in Arizona and all that, but that's a whole different story. But anyway, so he was Ted has always been someone I've been fascinated with, just because his baseball stuff obviously is incredible. His military career was incredible, but me as an angler, I've just always been fascinated by, kind of what a pioneer he was, how good he was with the fly rod in his hand and on the salt water. I mean, he had one guy describe it used to stand on his ice box in the front of the boat, and he would have his rod in his hand right here, and it was as if he was back at Fenway Park, with that bat in his hand, eyeing down the pitcher, waiting for that ball that apparently he could see. His eyesight was so good he could see the seams. Same deal. He's up on that ice box. He's got the rod. We're looking for a silver streak coming right at him. So I've always just been fascinated with Ted Williams.
Well, it was fascinating and adding to his legend. Great having him in the book, added more excitement, as if this book needed more excitement. We know that you personally have traveled the world observing and participating in the chase for all varieties of sea creatures, and you following the footsteps of many other well-known literary icons like Ernest Hemingway, Robert Frost, Wallace Stevens, Richard Braunigan, Jim Harrison, and many more. Would you share a story or two of some of your fellow literary buddies in conjunction with tarpon fishing?
I will, and I have to mention here, we're speaking of literary and people whose footsteps I've followed, and I have to mention my Uncle Charles Gaines, of course, a well-known novelist and writer, and a very good fisherman. Still sometimes outfishes me, which pisses me off, but I just learned to live with it now. So one thing that was really cool about doing this book is that I didn't know this going in, but what happened was I discovered that everything was connected within the saltwater fishing world. I mean, you can go all the way back to the Romans, just in the fly fishing world, really go all the way back to the Romans casting for trout, all the way through to the English kind of becoming fishermen, and then them importing it over to the United States when they moved over here. And the whole saltwater scene is all connected as well. So what went on in various tarpon spots across the world, across the country, across Florida, really, it kind of worked its way around Florida. Sort of started in Miami, went to Key West, and came back up to Homosassa, and now is back in the Keys. But when it got to Key West, to me, it was fascinating. There's a whole chapter dedicated to this, because it was a lot of my literary heroes were involved there. And what happened was Thomas of Gauvain, who's one of my favorite writers, had been to the Keys, I guess, when he was a little kid with his dad. And he always said once he graduated, he went to the Stegner School in Stanford. He said once he graduated and had a couple nickels to rub together, he was going to go down to Key West and fish for these tarpon that he'd been reading about in Field and Stream or whatever for all of his life. So he goes down there with his wife and young child and, sort of writes a book while he's down there, but really just fishes. And eventually him being down there attracts his friend, Jim Harrison, who of course wrote Legends of the Fall. And then they attract Russell Chatham, who is a very well-known, recently deceased, but was a very well-known Western landscape painter. So another artist. And then eventually those guys get Richard Braunigan, who wrote Trout Fishing in America, the kind of beat poem / novel. I'm not exactly sure how to describe that. I've read it, but it's doesn't have much of a plot, I'll put it that way. It's really interesting to read. But anyway, so you've got this group of artists in Key West, sort of as McGuane described it, sort of, performing their art in search of these fish. A lot of times art can be described as, trying to describe the ineffable. And hooking a tarpon is an experience really that I think can only be described as ineffable. I tried to describe it in the book. I think I said it was like hooking an 18-wheeler that jumped and cartwheeled and pinwheeled and stuff like that. But really, it's something that you have to kind of feel to sort of have it make any sense to yourself. Richard Braunigan, my favorite description of what it's like to hook and play a tarpon, he called it immediate unreality, which I just absolutely love. That's exactly what it is. You're all of a sudden transported into some, crazy different reality when you've hooked a tarpon. So these guys were down there. They were not only tarpon fishing, they were very dedicated to tarpon fishing. They were partying a lot on the side too. There were various recreational drugs and the fair sex involved. They were having a really good time, which of course is part of Key West's whole thing. I mean, that legacy of artists going there to fish goes back a long ways. I mean, Hemingway was down there met John Dos Passos, and they used to go out to the Marquesas from Key West. They would go out to an island out there. Wallace Stevens was there. Robert Frost was there. There's all kinds of great stories, which I dug up and put in there about, Wallace Stevens, the poet, went to a party one night in Key West and sidled up to this woman. And he said, I don't even like that Hemingway guy. I think he's got a bad attitude. I actually think he's a really bad writer too, is what he said to this lady. It turned out that was Hemingway's sister, who reported it to Ernest, who then waited outside for Wallace to walk out, and they got into a fist fight and all this kind of stuff. So there's always been this sort of fishing culture in Key West, but also this sort of, almost counterculture, but sort of partying culture as well. So it was fascinating to dive in, and I got to interview Russell Chatham before he died, thank God. Jim Harrison already passed away, but I got Guy Valdine was there as well, Tom McGuane, and it was just so cool to dive back into that, because I love fishing and I love all those writers and all those artists. And it was cool to sort of see all of these things, or to see this sport, which I love so much, expressed through these artists. And they all did, all of them mentioned how profoundly this era, when they were in Key West, they were there for 5 to 7 years, how profoundly it sort of affected their own art. McGuane wrote a novel about 92 Degrees in the Shade. He wrote a novel about tarpon fishing and guides. Jim Harrison wrote a lot about fishing. Russell Chatham painted these big dramatic landscapes, which were influenced by the big dramatic landscapes in Key West. Guy Valdine hasn't written very much, but what he's written has just been really, truly beautiful. And a lot of it's been about this type of thing. So, and it was also interesting. I've been living in New York now for a little while, and I lived in Soho, that neighborhood, when it was really beat up. And it was a haven for artists. Rent was cheap. All these artists moved in, and they made it really cool. And they made it so cool that all of a sudden it became expensive, because once they made it cool, all the hedge fund guys and the lawyers and all those people moved in and started buying up these places because they had made it cool. Now, to a certain degree, what these guys did in Key West, what McGuane and Harrison and these guys did in Key West, was to make tarpon fishing really cool. And what happened next was all of these rather wealthy folks like Billy Pate and Tom Evans get really into tarpon fishing. And it just reminded me sort of the, I don't know if you call it gentrification, but maybe that's the right word, of that neighborhood in Soho, when something is made cool by artists and then sort of subsumed by the moneyed class, I guess you could say. And that's what happened in Homosassa with the world record chase.
Well, we'd love to, if you take a minute or two, to contrast a normal person, if we can have a normal man going fly fishing for tarpon, and then the madman obsessiveness, I guess, like a typical fan go to a football, baseball game, they buy a ticket, they go to the game and go home. And would you contrast the folks who might want to take a day and go tarpon fishing compared to the obsessiveness and what these madmen do when they're after the world record?
So I would put myself kind of in that recreational category. I've fished very hard for them, and I fish very intently when I do it, but it's not the end of the world if I don't catch a fish that day. But so I would say that, the normal person, normal angler would just book a guide, and from 8 to 3 would go, out to a beautiful flat. What's cool about these huge fish, they grow up actually they grow to 360 pounds, but the ones on the flats are usually, 200 pounds and less. But it's just so cool. You're in 3 to 5 feet of water on white sand flats, and you see this enormous thing swimming at you, and you've got this 5-ounce, graphite rod and a fly about yay big, sometimes a little bit bigger. And you're supposed to go throw that thing in front of that huge fish, which has a mouth that's as big as its body, and it just grabs onto it. And it's really, truly one of the most thrilling experiences. In fact, it's so thrilling that a lot of people, myself included, have totally choked when the moment has come. The fish comes down and you see it and you're ready to do it, and you mess up your cast, or you you put the hook in your neck, or there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. And often it does, because you've got, what's known as buck fever. You just can't even believe you're standing in front of this prehistoric beast that could eat your fly. So for normal anglers, if you were just say you were just going down and fish for a couple of days, it's very fun to go to the Keys actually and just be on the boat and see these fish. You don't even necessarily have to. It's great to hook one, it's great to land one, but just to see them, to me, when I first went, was almost enough. I mean, it was just like the coolest thing to watch these humongous prehistoric beasts, silver-plated, gorgeous fish. So you would, normal angler would just go out from 8 to 3 and, try to hook a couple. A lot of times when people hook them, because they fight so hard, people just don't want to fight them, because it actually takes, you actually have to pull as hard as you can the hole for 2 hours sometimes even 12 hours if you're not very good at it. So a lot of people just hook one, have it jump, and they just break it off, and then they're done, and that they've had their experience. Contrast that with the hardcore guys. Not only are they out there for much longer, probably on the water for 12 hours, probably standing and staring into the water for 11 of those hours, maybe a short break for lunch. But they have that element, but they also have this meticulous way they have to tie all these their knots to make their leaders, which is like the terminal part of your fly line, the clear part, to make those legal in order to qualify for a world record tarpon. I mean, seriously, I've tied one in my life, and it took me 2 hours to tie all of the complicated knots. You've got to have this, you've got one piece of monofilament, which is tied onto another piece, which is tied onto what's called a shock tippet, which is about 80 pounds of test. And then you have the class tippet, which is the 16 or sometimes 8 pounds test. It's pretty crazy. So they do all that stuff as well. And then they're just after it, and they're after it. Tom Evans is after it, in his heyday was after it 30 to 35 days a year. And, some days they get blown off the water if there's a rainstorm or something like that. But, 98% of those days they were out there on the water for that entire month when the big fish came through Homosassa, in competition with not only the fish, but the other anglers who were on the flat also trying to break the record. So it was pretty intense. It was very intense on the water. It got super intense off the water too. I mean, these guys were blowing off some steam, I guess, off the water. And that was the drug of choice in Key West was marijuana. By the time it moved to Homosassa, we were in the 80s. So I guess you can probably guess which drug was the drug of choice then. And so, things got really kind of crazy. So crazy that in the end, really everything broke. I mean, these guys broke their lines, they broke their rods, they broke their marriages, they broke their lives. A couple people died, and then the fishery went to hell too. I mean, if the fish weren't exempt from this destruction which took place because of this madness and because of this obsession. Wow.
I don't want to close without showing what a world record 202-pound tarpon looks like. This is Jim Holland Jr. in 2001. What's the scoop on this guy?
So what's really interesting, so you had this group of really hardcore anglers who had been after the record for 5 to 10 years, sometimes longer than that. But it was a kind of select group of the quote unquote greatest anglers in the world. It was Tom Evans and Billy Pate, Stu Apt, Ted Williams was there for a little while. And of course, the way that life works out, you had this young guy come in 2001 who had, I think he'd been to Homosassa once before maybe, and he was just there for 5 days. He was with his dad. They were serious anglers, but they weren't necessarily going after the record. And of course, he breaks the record, and not only breaks the record, but also he catches the biggest tarpon that's ever been recorded caught on a fly. Not only that, he breaks the mythical, the 200-pound mark on a fly was sort of the mythical holy grail, and he breaks that too. And of course, in the process of that, broke the hearts of all of these guys who were after it at that point. I mean, I think Tom Evans had been after it for that point for about 30 years, and Billy Pate had as well. And it's just, of course, that's how life works out. Somebody comes in, and he received so much sort of weird blowback, not only from the hardcore record chasers, but also, the media kind of got funny with him, and other people got funny with him. He's actually never returned. He went there that one time, caught the big fish. It's kind of like a walk-off home run. He's never been back to Homosassa. So but that's a big, big fish. And as you'll see in that, if you saw that picture, it's a little bit icky how they, to a lot of people, how world record, you in order to qualify a tarpon for a world record, unlike say a trout or a bass, you have to kill it. A trout, you can actually weigh it and then put it back in the water. You can't, tarpon are too big to do that. So the way they weigh it is they string it up on a tree, which is in this day and age, and to some people back in the day as well, is not a very appetizing sight. So, you'll see that. I don't know if you actually can see the string in that photograph, but you don't see a whole lot of people posting those pictures anymore. In fact, there are not a lot of world record chasers anymore, I think, just because we've evolved in sort of how we view our resources in the ocean, that they're not necessarily infinite, that they are finite, and that we should take care of them.
Well, it's the whole book is fascinating. There's so much in there, as we have discussed, that is not fishing, that's life. As we approach the end, I would love to read from the book jacket the quote from the one and only Carl Hyacin. And I will quote, "This is the story of the obsessed, unhinged, and often brilliant dreamers who chase giant tarpon, a primeval fish with breathtaking glamour and ungodly strength. The thrill of hooking one on a fly rod is impossible to exaggerate. So you can believe every word of Monty Burke's funny, wistful, wonderful book. He is clearly as sick as the rest of us." Pretty apt quote, and I think folks can believe Carl Hyacin. Monty, thank you so much for taking time to talk about this awesome, wonderful book. I guess we shouldn't ask this close to pub date, what are you working on?
I actually have this is a pretty crazy confluence of events now. I have this book coming out. I've just started work on a new book. But more pressingly, we just got a 8-week-old yellow lab puppy, which has kept me up 2 nights in a row, but is the cutest thing you've ever seen. So there's a lot going on right now, but I'm working on a new book. I'll tell you about it. I can't tell you about it right now, but I'll let you know when I can.
Well, when you can, and when it's published, this time, let's not have long distance. Let's not have coronavirus. Come on down to Alabama and let's have a real old-fashioned book signing.
That sounds great. Thank you, Jake. Thanks for having me on here. I really appreciate it.
We appreciate you taking your time, and thanks so much for signing all those book plates in these books. Okay, everybody, thank you for watching, and buy this book, give this book. Thanks.
To purchase the first edition of Lords of the Fly, signed by Monty Burke on a beautiful bookplate, go to alabamabooksmith.com.